presentation itself.
Yes.
Okay, I'll start now. So yes, the work I'm presenting today is based on adaptive decision-making in an urban coastal agent modeling framework. It's the work that forms my PhD thesis, and I am supervised by Professor Sheffron and Dr. Dmitry Kovalevsky. So this work and my PhD is part of the MOOCs project. It's a project carried out at the Helmholtz Institute for Climate Service Science, which is a cooperation between the Climate Service Center, JERIX, and the University of Hamburg. The idea of this project is to model the complex dynamics of coastal cities under climate change in order to plan adaptation strategies and support coastal climate services. So throughout the project, 4 modeling approaches will be used. And the model I'm presenting today is a demonstration of the first approach, agent-based modeling. A slight overview for those of you who may not be familiar with it. Agent-based modeling utilizes individual actors known as agents, which act independently by interacting with the system they inhabit and any other agents that may be present. And they follow certain decision rules to achieve their separate goals. The advantage of ABM is that it offers a deeper insight to how small-scale changes affect an overall system. As a result, we often find that implementing basic rules leads to complex emergent patterns. This makes agent-based modeling an ideal paradigm to model systems such as the coastal city. Avians also possess the advantage of having all the underlying mechanisms visible, so you can track and analyze all the causal pathways. So there isn't a black box there. There are some limitations to agent-based modeling, some aspects. Due to its nature, it is required that when you're building the model, the system is known at a much higher level of detail than you would require in an aggregate model, for example. So this is because parameters are modeled at an individual level. So what usually happens is parameters are given random values in a prescribed range to simulate the heterogeneity of the system. This also leads to another limitation, which is that due to their disaggregated nature, ABMs are more computationally intensive than the equivalent counterparts in an aggregated approach. So for our model, we employ the viable framework for agent-based modeling and implement it for a single agent case in a coastal city. The framework developed in Professor Sheffron's work is related to viability theory, which seeks to describe agents bounded to an area within which they are viable. Agents in these systems possess adaptive control, which means they act on the system using their limited capabilities in an effort to adapt to it as it changes. The driving force for agent action in the viable framework is the gap between the current state of the system and the agent's desired state. So this is the cycle of decision of an agent in the viable model, which you might recognize from Professor Sheffron's presentation earlier. The action parts represent the agent's primary agency within the system. It has these multiple routes that it can invest resources into, and what it wants is to shift the system state towards the target value. So our system is currently in a non-spatially explicit form, though we do plan to extend it to a spatially explicit version. It is an arbitrary area designated as the coastal city, with a certain fraction lying on the coast itself and thus vulnerable to climate change-induced damages, and the rest being inland. Over the course of the simulation, gradually rising sea levels threaten the coastal territory unless sufficiently developed coastal defenses are present. We represent this in terms of their height, which is the amount of sea level rise that they can effectively protect from. We dictate this minimum threshold height, which is how much higher than the sea level the defenses need to be to result in a zero damage case. So faced with these potential damages, the single city planner agent has 2 options before it to mitigate them. It can develop the city's coastal defenses, which when undeveloped deteriorate over time, or as a more extreme measure, it can relocate coastal territory inland. It can allocate resources from the income generated by the city towards these 2 pathways. This means that the behavior of the agent can be represented by 2 control variables: the amount of capital it invests towards overall mitigation and the fraction of this investment that it allocates to each pathway. So it selects the control variables, these 2 control variables that results in the maximum value. So it is an optimizing agent. The value is the balance between the agent's utility and negative utility, or disutility in this case. The positive term comes from the amount of resources consumed. So that's the capital remaining after investments have been allocated. And the negative term comes from the damages sustained by the city. Going by the common definition of risk, it's a function of hazard times vulnerability. So the former is the excess sea level over the minimum threshold height mentioned earlier, and the latter is the vulnerable coastal fraction of the city territory. So here's a schematic representation of the main processes of the model. As a summary of the previous slides, the agent acts on the system through its investments into these two adaptation pathways, which in turn affects state variables, which eventually affect agent value. So for the analysis of the model, we divide the system state and agent variables into independent and dependent variables. So the independent ones set the initial condition for the simulation, like the amount of coastal territory or the starting pattern of agent investment. They can also include parameters that are outside of the agent's control, like the efficiency of investments in both pathways, or how sea level evolves over the course of the simulation. The dependent parameters together represent the output of the system. So such as where the agent invests the resources, the heights, how the height of the coastal defenses evolves over time, how the distribution between coastal and inland territory evolves, and what amount of damages are sustained or avoided over the course of the simulation. As is common in agent-based models, we introduce a probabilistic element through climate shocks in the form of extreme sea level events. So these are randomized, short-lasting, but severe increases in sea level that gradually increase in frequency and severity over time. So they provide a push for the agent to take action beyond just baseline sea level rise. Due to this element, every simulation is essentially different. So the practice is to study generalized average behavior over a number of simulations. And for the purposes of analysis, we construct various scenarios, which are represented as bundles of parameters that can represent different situations, such as faster sea level rise or slower investment shifts in the agent action. So we can see how the agent adapts differently in each case and how successful it is. Here's a snapshot of the model as it runs. It's coded in NetLogo, and we track various variables as they progress over the course of the simulation. The behavior that we find of the agent as a result is the agent is a highly reactive one because it lacks predictive capability. So it only invests towards adaptation when damages are sustained to the city, and it drops the investment once these damages are mitigated. So as you can see, it's these extreme sea level events seen as these spikes that motivate the agent to start pouring investments into coastal defenses. And if you take the height of coastal defenses as a proxy for agent action, we find that it closely follows the trend of sea level rise. This is a consequence of its reactivity, because it develops the coastal defenses when the sea level is past the threshold height, and then it lets them deteriorate until the sea level exceeds it again. And out of these two adaptation options, as you probably saw, the agent really only favors the coastal defense development over relocation. This is expected because relocation is a more expensive process, and it also decreases the agent's income because the coastal territory is more valuable in terms of capital. So it's disincentivized by the model. So the agent really is able to successfully adapt using this one option. So what do I mean by adaptation success? We develop these parameters to measure the success that will help us define and quantify this success and compare it across scenarios. So I'll hurry through this a little bit. One of the most likely parameter you can use to measure success is the amount of hypothetical damages that are avoided. So you take a simulation where there is no action by the agent, and then you compare every scenario to that case. And So all damages, the difference between the damages in these scenarios is the damages that have been avoided by agent adaptation. Then we can measure the time steps where the fraction of time steps where the height of coastal defenses exceeds sea level. So that means the fraction where there are no damages. And you can also approach it from a cost benefit perspective, where you compare the avoided damages to the resources invested by the agent. I would go into detail if in the discussion if necessary. I'll move to the outlook now, the conclusion. So the next few steps, we plan to extend the model to multiple agents. That's one of the best strengths of the viable framework. The interactions between agents leads to complex behavior, emergent patterns. So that's the major extension we plan. And we also, it will allow us to move it from the urban planner level to a more local level, like the household level, for example. And we then plan to give them expectations of the future, so the agents can take more proactive action instead of the reactive behavior that you see. And then once we have this concrete foundation of set decision rules, we can make this model spatially explicit and import maps of cities that we select as case study areas from GIS into NetLogo. Furthermore, we plan to combine this model with a mobility model that we developed as a version of Sugarscape. You might have seen it in Professor Sheffron's presentation earlier. The idea is to combine these two models and add this mobile element, which is basically then another action that individual agents can take to adapt to rising sea levels. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.